This instructional video will walk you through the features of the spending plan template. I'm Norm Suchar from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'll be explaining how to fill out the template in this 10-minute video. The first thing that you'll notice is that there are several tabs at the bottom of the screen. The first tab is the Overview tab, which provides an overview of the spending template. Then there are three yellow tabs: Lists, Funding Detail, and Plan Changes. These are all tabs where you'll be entering data that will be used in other places in the spreadsheet. The blue tabs, Funding Summary, Charts, and Organizational Summary, are tabs that summarize data. You won't have to enter any data into these tabs. So let's start by walking through the Lists tab. The first column is a list of activities. It's a standardized list, so you won't be making any changes to this column. The next column is a list of funding sources. It already includes some of the major funding sources, but you'll want to add additional funding sources in your community. For example, if there's a large foundation that provides funding for homeless assistance in your community, you'd put the name of the foundation in the list. Likewise, if the county provides funding, you would put the name of the county funding source in the list. We'll also add the name of another private funding source. Let's just say it's a bank. Adding funding sources to this list will help you fill out other parts of the spending plan template, which you'll see in a few moments. The last column is a list of organizations that provide homeless assistance in your community. What you'll want to do is list all the organizations that provide some type of homeless assistance in your continuum of care geography. Some of these organizations will provide more than one type of homeless assistance, and that's fine. You just need to put in every organization once. The next tab is the Funding Detail tab. This is where you provide information about the organizations that are providing homeless assistance, the strategies that they're being funded to provide, the funding sources, and the amounts of funding that they're receiving from those sources. There's a sample on the right side here, but we'll go ahead and fill out the rest of the tab so you can see how it works. One thing you'll notice about the spreadsheet is that there are some cells with these red arrows in the top right corner, like you see here. When you hover your mouse over those cells, a little instruction pops up and it tells you something about the cell. For example, this one tells you that if you click on a box, then click on the arrow next to the box, you can choose from a list of organizations. So let's go ahead and start with Organization A. And you'll see here now that we have all the strategies that we listed in the earlier Lists tab. So let's select Year-Round Shelter as the strategy. Let's say one of the funding sources is the federal ESG program, the Emergency Solutions Grants program. And let's say that it provides $60,000 in funding. You can round these figures to the nearest $1,000. You don't have to be super specific about the amounts you put in. Also, you should be putting annual amounts in this column. For example, if a project has a 2-year grant for $120,000, you'd put in $60,000 representing the annual amount. We're going to go ahead now and quickly fill in the rest of this tab. There are a few things you should know. First of all, most organizations receive funding from more than one source for each activity, so you'll just enter those on multiple lines. For example, if Organization A receives funding for shelter from 3 different funding sources, you'd have 3 different lines for those. Also, organizations typically provide more than one type of homeless assistance, and so again, you would enter those as separate lines, as you can see we're doing here. Next, let's look at the Funding Detail tab. As you can see here, this tab has pulled in the information from the previous tabs and summarized it in this column here. The next step is to fill out 2 sections, the section on the next 12 months, this green section, and a section on the next 5 years, this blue section. There are 3 columns in each of these sections. One is for new funding. In this column, we try to identify any new funding that we expect to receive in the next 12 months for any of these strategies. Let's say, for example, that we're expecting a new motel voucher program of about $50,000. So we'd enter that here. This is a good time to point out that the darker shaded boxes are places where information is summarized. For example, the emergency shelter line summarizes the information from the 3 different types of emergency shelter, the same for transitional housing. So you're only entering information into the lighter boxes, you don't enter information into the darker shaded boxes. And we'll go ahead and quickly fill in some more information. This next column is for reallocated funding. This is funding we expect to shift from one area to another. Let's use an example of shifting funding from a transitional housing program to a rapid rehousing program. And let's say we're shifting $100,000. We would do this by entering minus $100,000 into the appropriate transitional housing line. So you are actually entering a negative number there. And then we enter $100,000 in the rapid rehousing line. Let's also assume we're reallocating $25,000 from an outreach program to a homelessness prevention program. So we would put negative $25,000 in the outreach line and $25,000 in the homelessness prevention line. This third column is where we would expect to see reduced funding for some reason. For example, a grant that we don't expect to be renewed that's expiring. For example, let's assume that we're losing $10,000 in annual funding for a year-round shelter. We'll enter negative $10,000 in that line. The last column will sum up all the changes we've made. So that's showing us how much we expect to be spending 12 months from now on all of these strategies. This blue section is similar to the green section, except now we're looking at the next 5 years. There are a few important points about this section. The changes you've made in the 12-month section may also be reflected in the next 5 years section. The way to think about it is that if it's going to affect the annual level of spending 5 years from now, then you want it included in the blue section. 5 years is obviously a long time. It's hard to predict with certainty how much you'll be spending on these various strategies 5 years from now. So you'll have to do your best to project what you think that spending level will be. The purpose of this exercise is for your COC to have an intentional plan about what direction it wants to go with spending on different strategies and priorities. So you'll really want to have discussions within your COC about what you want your strategies and funding levels to look like 5 years from now. And that should be what gets reflected in this blue section of the spending plan template. Let's use an example here. Let's say your COC is being fairly ambitious and you're looking to shift half the spending on transitional housing to rapid rehousing. So here we'll enter negative $350,000, which is half of the transitional housing spending in the transitional housing line, and we'll be adding $350,000 to the rapid rehousing line. We'll also assume that you have a strategy for identifying new funding for data in HMIS, so we'll assume you are able to identify $100,000 there, and maybe an additional $50,000 for a coordinated assessment, and we'll enter those in those lines there. Let's go ahead and finish this section up. We'll assume that the child care spending that we had identified earlier, $50,000, will continue, and so we'll add that there, and we'll also assume that the funding that was shifted from outreach to homelessness prevention is long-term, so we'll add those there as well. So now we've filled out all the parts of the spreadsheet that require you to enter data. So now let's look at the parts that summarize that data. We'll start with a funding summary tab, and the first thing you'll see is that the information we've inputted in the other tabs is all summarized here. You'll see that for the example we put in, there was about $2.6 million in total funding, $1.2 million from the Continuum of Care program, $110,000 from the ESG program, etc. Next, let's look at the Charts tab. This first chart on the left shows how funding is currently allocated, how you expect it to be allocated 12 months from now, and how you expect it to be allocated 5 years from now based on your COC's priorities. The chart summarizes the spending categories, so for example, the green bar shows all the permanent housing spending. The chart on the right summarizes your funding sources. The final tab is the Organizational Summary tab. This provides a summary of funding for each organization by funding source. That concludes the instructional video. We hope it's been helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at the center at naeh.org. Thank you.